Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. Finally. Well, I say finally. I have already seen a Marvel Cinematic Universe film in the cinema this year, so I can't complain. But a new Marvel Cinematic Universe film that it isn't something we've been waiting decades to see, doesn't have, a sense of, this how it ties into the MCU. An entirely new character, an entirely new chapter within the story with its own personality, its own style. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. It's so nice to be back in the cinema watching a MCU film. MCU films, I appreciate that a lot of people have criticisms that the MCU is very formulaic. It has a certain style to it. It has certain requirements to be part of the MCU, not just in terms of the Marvel Comics narrative, but in terms of the fact it has little bits of humour to it. It has certain moments and plot beats that are required to fulfill the sort of Marvel storytelling sort of structure. And that people say, well, it's one's like another, and yet it's so good to be back and seeing them again. We've gone 2 years without being able to see a Marvel Cinematic Universe film in the cinema. And then, of course, we had Black Widow, which was great, but Black Widow definitely felt like a hangover from the previous era, whereas Shang-Chi feels like a definitive manifesto on what the future of the MCU is going to look like. This is the step forward. This is what, you can infer from here what our plans are and what kind of stories we're wanting to tell. And I think it's such a strong relief. So, Shang-Chi is not a character who I have a great deal of knowledge of. This isn't a case where it's like, I was aware of Iron Man, but didn't really pay much attention to him. Or Spider-Man, who I know oodles about. Or, even someone like Thor, who I remember being 19, I think, when the first Thor film came out, and just rolled my eyes thinking, what a weird character to make a film about. And then, of course, found out how great Thor is and how great Chris Hemsworth is. Or Guardians, which admittedly came out of nowhere. Shang-Chi is a character Shang-Chi is probably on the same level as Guardians, where I knew the name vaguely. I'm sure he had appeared in comics that I'd heard of in crossover events, but frankly, unknown character to me. And had no real ties to the grander Marvel Cinematic Universe in a way that I knew. And there was something refreshing about that. Because even Guardians of the Galaxy, you have that sense of, it ties to Thanos, it ties to Adam Warlock, who we'll get eventually. There are still links to the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe. Shang-Chi feels like it's such a fresh take, and such a way to be able to go, let's tell brand new story with a character who, we don't know a lot about, so frankly, you could tell me anything. And I wouldn't know enough to be able to say, that's not really what the comic was about, or, that's not really how I imagine the character. This is fresh. This is entirely untapped ground. But yeah, so the film follows Shang-Chi, who, of course, is the greatest martial arts master, according to the comics. Purportedly, I even watched a video today about how technically he is the best fighter in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Better than Iron Fist, better than Daredevil. He is purportedly the best fighter. And so therefore, if you're going to do this incredibly martial arts heavy, greatest fighter in the world story, you're going to have to really pull out a proper martial arts heavy film. And Destin Daniel Cretton absolutely nails it. You forget that this is a Marvel film in certain periods because it genuinely feels like a proper martial arts classic film. Or if it's not a martial arts film in its true nature, it feels like it is homaging the martial arts genre and the history of martial arts films, to the point where there are certain action scenes and you go, wow, this is like a Jackie Chan combat scene, and this is homaging that. Oh, this is like a Jet Li martial arts scene, it's homaging that. And certain set pieces feel like a representation of the history of martial arts films up to now, and I think that is shows a truly deft hand and a knowledge of the genre and how it can feed into this completely different genre. And so yeah, and it's tricky because this is a film of two halves, I suppose. You have your first half, which is very street level, and there was another question that was arising with Shang-Chi, which Shang-Chi is purportedly a very street level hero. He's not in game, travelling through time, punching mad titans. He is martial artist. And so when I heard this film was coming out, there were major questions about, this feels very low key, this feels very street level. And although that works for things like the Netflix Marvel stuff, it does sort of bring up that question of, is it going to feel a little underwhelming? That you're going to have this quite small storytelling style, this ground level stuff in the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so if you ever do bring Shang-Chi in, is he going to feel very small potatoes compared to someone like Thor? Frankly, he's great. He is really, your lead actor, I did hear, and unfortunately it is one of those cases where I heard bits and bobs about the film, and unfortunately my perception feels like it's in response to that. So everyone said, oh, this lead is a great Marvel Cinematic Universe lead. What was his name again, the actor? Producer wife? The name of Shang-Chi's actor?
Simu Liu.
Simu Liu. That's right. Simu Liu. People said, oh, Simu Liu is going to be the next Chris Evans. He is at that tier of actor, and he's going to be one of the heavy hitters who carries the story for the MCU forward. Admittedly, that sets a high bar, and so when I was watching him, unfortunately, I was watching him with that in my mind, and I like him. He's a very good actor. However, that's a very heavy weight to put upon someone, and I think with that in my mind, I was sort of saying, well, he's not particularly that great. He is good. He does a good job, but he's not. I have yet to think, oh, he is going to be the next great Marvel Cinematic Universe actor. I love the character, I think, and again, I think in terms of his combat ability, I think he's great, and I think he carries that side of the story. I just don't know. I didn't feel like I got this huge range performance-wise that I've heard in respect of the reviews. And then you have Awkwafina, who plays Katie, his friend, who's only ever known him during his time in Los Angeles. San Francisco. Close, but no potato. San Francisco, who she is also an Asian American, but she's Chinese born or Chinese descendant, and has no idea of his life. But she's the sort of ride along character who learns about him, and of course learns about his family and his legacy. And some people again said she is the comedy character, and again, yes, she's funny. It's Awkwafina, and Awkwafina does the humour side of stuff, and she does the funny reactions, and she knows how to play big. But frankly, she's not. There are certain points in this film where she's playing it straight. She's playing it, as the friend who is trying to support her friend who she knew nothing about. And there is this beautiful sense of a character who doesn't know what to do with her life. And that's a huge theme about the idea of this sort of lost person. And then a conversation is brought up to her about history and legacy and your family and your descendants and your people. And you get this real strong sense of a character who doesn't have that. And she plays that so well. She plays that sense of someone who is lost and doesn't feel that sense of legacy. You know, a woman who, though, as I say, is a Chinese descendant, is American. She is American, and so therefore feels like she doesn't have that same connection to her history from a land that she's never been to in a language she doesn't speak. And I think that does require a really good actor to be able to play that. But I've been sort of holding off so that I could talk about the main guy, the character who absolutely brings this film to the next level, which is weirdly the villain, which is quite funny, talking about Marvel Cinematic Universe villains, and that is Tony Leung as Wen Wu, or as we were referring to him in the run-up to this film, the Mandarin. Not the Guy Pearce, Aldrich Killian Mandarin, the proper comic book Mandarin. So, sidebar, because this is really what my conversation wants to be about primarily. The Marvel Comics has a very long history of being unable, not being able to represent racial diversity in any particularly nuanced or even tasteful way. Inexplicably, Black Panther, at certain points, has been alright, and so when we got the Black Panther film, it felt like, it lifted the subject matter, but it didn't have to make an apology. Whereas when you have the character of the Mandarin, and there is a reason why Iron Man 3 is so troubled, and especially in relation to the Mandarin, because this is a character who, frankly, in the comics, is a very troubled character, a problematic story, because he is supposed to represent, an image of Asian culture from a 1960s American perspective. And unfortunately, what that ultimately leads into is the very racist Americanized portrayals of Chinese and Asian people, East Asian people. And of course, so we're talking the Fu Manchu, essentially, the long beards, the mysticism, the slightly corrupt nature, and it ages incredibly poorly. It ages as poorly as the Talons of Wen Chiang, the Doctor Who story, which is the character has some great history and he has a great relationship to Iron Man. And in his own right, he is an interesting villain and has lived through the decades as a great foil against Tony Stark. As a representation of Asian culture, it is incredibly racist, ages like soured milk, and frankly, it's hard to look back upon. Unfortunately, of course, when he reached the 90s, they then tried to fix that by making him less representative of sort of the Asian culture and he's more alien than that. So they gave him reptile hands. In the 90s Iron Man TV show, they made his skin green. Unfortunately, that then feeds into a different racial representation. The idea of different races being the othering of racial representation. That somehow being Asian and being an alien, like from another worldly alien, are one and the same thing. And so you see the problem. And so by the time you get to Iron Man 3, they just don't want to do it. And so they royally mess it up with Iron Man 3. And so we come to this. And so you get to Shang-Chi, and then they announce that the Mandarin is going to play Shang-Chi's father. And of course that resolves one of two things. One, it allows them to do a truly Asian representation of the Mandarin. And it also deals with the fact that Shang-Chi's father was originally Fu Manchu. And so therefore so you think, okay, so you're in the right direction, but how's that going to actually look on screen? Are we going to get something that feels like it represents, it isn't a racist portrayal, Americanized version of Asian storytelling? And are we going to get a Mandarin that is acceptable, that isn't racist, but isn't a joke like Trevor Slattery or Aldrich Killian, where it's just like this is dishonouring the character in the terms of fictional storytelling, even though you're trying to sidestep the troubling racial stuff. This film does it in spades. Tony Leung is a great Mandarin. He is truly a great villain with complex plot, and he's not a straight villain. He's villainous, and he has the 10 rings, and it feeds back into to Iron Man films, and a legacy of being this, hundreds of year old criminal with powers and truly a villain. But he's, in regards to the story, he has much more complex motives, and he is a much more nuanced character. And frankly, as people have talked about endlessly with MCU and their villain problem, this is the situation where they go, yes, we know how to tell a villain here that really feels like it ticks all the right boxes. And again, Tony Leung plays it phenomenally. And so yeah, so you and to the point where the Mandarin, there is even a conversation piece about how the fact that even in terms of the MCU, they call someone the Mandarin, and he talks about the nature of that name and the fact that he's had many names throughout the hundreds of years, but the Mandarin is almost one of the most foolish ones because it's an orange, it's a fruit. And the idea that of course Americans, appropriate an American businessman appropriated it, and then they started referring to him as an orange. It's almost, he beautifully explains and explores how that, doesn't really work, and yet at the same time it did work, but he is something else. He is more than that. So, the fact that from now on, if I was to discuss it, I refer to him as Wen Wu, which is the character's name. But like I say, great villain, and I think he absolutely makes this film. As I said, the martial arts in this is phenomenal. It is a truly great martial arts film. And then you get to the second half, and I'm not going to spoil too much about it, but the second half is a very different film. It goes from a very gritty, street-level martial arts film, and then goes more into the mystical, Lord of the Rings. It's very much the way that I was watching it, and unfortunately my knowledge of East Asian fantasy in cinema or even in storytelling is not particularly strong. So I could only think of sort of referencing, well, it's a little bit Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and it's a bit Raya the Last Dragon. You get that sense of, I was sort of interpolating it through my own sort of genre experience. And as I was watching it, I'm like, yeah, this has gone, like I say, real Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe meets Raya the Last Dragon. And it becomes armies and mystical things fighting each other. And that's fine for the most part. But it doesn't have the grittiness of the first, I'd say 2 acts maybe, where I liked the hard-hitting, street-level combat. And it's not that the final act doesn't have a little bit of that, but it definitely veers more towards bigger scale fantasy. It no longer has that sense of street level combat to it. And of course it does have your MCU references and cameos, and I won't spoil them because some of them I feel like even the trailers shouldn't have revealed because they're not much greater than the trailer shows. And it does tie into the MCU, but there are some really fun cameos, and one extended cameo that's so good that frankly he's not a cameo, he is a main character towards the end of the film. And it ties in so nicely to the MCU and yet still feels like it has its own identity that you can, like I say, you can forget it. You can just watch it and go, oh, that's an interesting character to add to the cast. And again, it sets up again MCU, massive plans, story building, lots going forward. But as a standalone film, this was so much fun, and it really does create a great addition to the world building of the MCU and gives us some really great characters to play with going forward. I'm so glad we're back. I know the Eternals is theoretically coming, assuming that everything goes according to plan with the global situation, and then we have Spider-Man, and of course I will continue my MCU retrospectives. I do have a plan for them. I've taken a bit of a prolonged break, but I will finish the last 5 films within the retrospective towards the end of the year. Thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because this all helps in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of almost 250 videos. And follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.